Good Yontif. Now, those of you who are here, the sanctuary is absolutely packed. Why you're not all going for a walk inside? Is it raining outside? I haven't been outside. No? Okay. So you are all here on your own free will and volition to be part of this dialogue, to listen from two proud congregants here for the next hour of their lives. They are not private citizens, but in the moment this hour closes, they get to put on their tallis and go back to davening, and you're not allowed to bug them until you see them at Three Guys or wherever they eat. Okay, so those are the rules of the game. It is a great pleasure to introduce our two friends and dialogue participants. Dr. Richard Haass, a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations, President Emeritus at the Council on Foreign Relations, after having served as CFR's president for 20 years, a senior counselor with Centerview Partners, an international investment banking advisory firm. In 2013, he chaired multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. He has done so many things, and I'm not giving you short thrift, but it's specifically of your 14 books on American foreign policy. The one I want to focus on today is your book on American democracy. It's your latest, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, a New York Times bestseller. He has his Substack, Home and Away. Let's welcome Dr. Haass. Dr. Julian Zelizer is a New York Times best-selling author and the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, a columnist for foreign policy, and publishes his own Substack called The Long View, a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now, a prominent analyst on numerous television and radio networks, the award-winning author and editor of 27 books. Dr. Haass, you thought you were good, but...
I am shamed.
Including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. He received awards for Fault Lines, A History of the United States since 1974, and Dr. Zelizer has published over 1,500 op-eds, fellowships, Guggenheim, Russell Stage, New York Historical Society, and he's completing two new works, a book about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the 1964 Democratic Convention, and an edited volume, The Presidency of Joseph R. Biden, Jr., a first historical assessment. Let's welcome Dr. Zelizer. Gentlemen, I thought, we would do something easier. Last year, we talked a lot, Dr. Haass, about foreign policy. I said, let's pivot to something, that we can all agree on about the state of the nation at America at 250. And that seemed like such a good idea in May when we thought of this. It is the whole theme, as you saw on Rosh Hashanah, that it was on the seats, the lectures, the civic programs for our teens, for our adults, trips to civil rights sites. We are focusing on America at 250, the founding documents. This is the kickoff program of it. Where's Max Alperstein? Now, Max Alperstein, I'm going to use, normally, Max, we don't let you speak because you are blowing the shofar or reading the Torah. But I'm going to ask, come on, get in, you're not shy, I know you. So I'm going to ask you to read what I gave you to read up until I mark the page.
Yeah, okay.
The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal stations to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Thank you, Max. So let's, now that we, in good Jewish fashion, can agree on the text, Dr. Zelizer, let me start with you. Based on what Max just read, it strikes me that the founding document, the Declaration, is on the one hand a political act, and on the other hand it's a philosophical statement. And so can you, as the Broadway musical says, can you bring us to the room where it happened? What were some of the forces? Why does it feel like it's multiple documents all in one?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be doing this with the two of you, and I think both are true. I think there are a lot of philosophical arguments that the founders cared about. Some revolved around the rights of the individual, which we just heard about, the inalienable rights that every individual and citizen should have, the rights that a person has in relationship to government. There was another philosophical part that we didn't get to, which is about the abuse of power, which was very much on the minds of the founders. The founders were very cognizant of centralized power, of corruption, and about the fragility of republics. This was something they talked about all the time. If you look at the pamphlets, that was their main issue. So these were all concerns that they were very much aware of. And then there was the immediate. These were colonists dealing with a government that was not offering them representation, where the center and the periphery had become separated. And I think that's the political context combined with the philosophical context, which is what gives this declaration such power.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you look at the full text, more time is spent as an indictment, if you will, of the power that be, of the British monarchy, the English monarchy, than of what they wanted to create. And when you look at the first thing after this, they ultimately did create the Articles of Confederation. Again, the whole bias was against anything in the form of a strong central government. People forget that when they formed under the Articles of Confederation, which is, if you will, Constitution 1.0, each of the states was sovereign. There was essentially no executive. So this is the mentality of the time, which was, again, very strongly against centralized power. One other thing comes through from this, is in some reasons why the Declaration is so important still, is that it based really on ideas. And that, to me, is the brilliance of the formation of this country. Yes, it talks about men and so forth, but let's move beyond, if you will, the modern mentality. It was, and obviously there was slavery and so forth. So these were people of their time. But it was extraordinary to build a country on an idea, on this notion of rights, what they were against and what they were for. And that really was an extraordinary development in history.
Dr. Zelizer, is this a compromise document? Were there forces acting at odds with each other? Is there a way we can sort of unpack this in a way that sort of reveals some of the tensions of the moment? Some people wanted it one way. I just take it that everyone knows this document, but maybe it's my Talmudic background that I feel there must have been arguments going into this document.
Well, I mean, I think you have to think of the Declaration and then ultimately the Constitution as a whole, and you can see some of the tensions playing out in terms of a general agreement of the problem, a general agreement of the threat. There's also, I'd add to the concern with centralized power, is a fundamental distrust of individuals at some level, meaning there's a fear of what can happen when power gets into the wrong hands. And the Constitution will ultimately be an effort to check this as much as possible. But there's a difference already here, it's latent, about what should the government, this new government, actually look like? Because they themselves are in the process of constituting their own centralized government. This is a declaration of independence, but we know where this is going to lead. And I think that tension, which we still live with today, over kind of what should the authority of the state, big government, be? What is the relationship between the center and the periphery here? Once we're going to form that, they're thinking about it with England. And here, ultimately, one of the tensions was, what would the relationship be with England? It was a big deal to break with what you were part of. And I don't think everyone had total cognizance, even as they were in the process of doing it. But that fundamental debate over not simply power and its corruption, but what is the role of government in our society, is already brewing as they break with the government they've been part of.
Right, and that, I think it was, who wrote the 1776? Was that McCulloch, or that?
McCulloch wrote.
Yeah, the idea of the very act of naming independence was unto itself a very, it wasn't an agreed upon decision.
Well, yeah, I mean, the historians who write about this always remind us that they thought of themselves as part of England. And we see what happens after. So it wasn't a total unanimity in terms of what that actually meant and what they would do next, as Richard was saying with the articles come next.
Right. Thank you. Now, I take it, to stick with my language, this is Torah, right? That it is the founding and shared document. Has it always been this way? I think it was, I think Wills might have had his book on Gettysburg, that the reception history of the document through U.S. history has not been uniform, that at different moments it's been in the forefront, sometimes it's been in the background, that it's not just, it hasn't been a linear journey, that the Declaration. I was wondering if either of you gentlemen could reflect on different moments of U.S. history where the Declaration has played different roles.
Want to start?
You start.
All right, I would say two things. One is how we understand the Declaration has changed. So where I started about the fears that the founders had about the corruption of power was something, if you read about the Declaration decades ago, you wouldn't have read about. You would have read about John Locke. You would have read about the individual. And over time, historians said that's not actually what they were worried about. They were worried about centralized power and corruption. And you can, again, read a little later, that's what this is about. And they looked at the pamphlets that the guy named Bernard Balin and J.J. Pocock, these historians, looked at what this was, and we reinterpreted what really this was about. It wasn't simply about the individual. It was about how to deal with power. One. Two, it's been contested. What this means is not self-evident. It is a little Torah-like. And it has been used as a text that can mean very different things. The contradiction you talked about, that some of these founders were, all of these founders were living in a slave-holding system, is a contradiction that would become more pronounced and more understood over time. You would have civil rights leaders invoke this in a very different way than a Southern Democrat years earlier would invoke the same kind of text. I don't think there's like just stages in a way Wills is arguing, but even today, this same thing means very different, different Talmudic arguments based on this, depending on how you understand where we are.
Let me say two things. One, building on both on those points. One is it's Torah in the sense it was the first document. Right. But now, when we think about American politics, we've got, there's the Federalist Papers, there's the Constitution, there's any number of court decisions, there's the Gettysburg Address, and so forth. So this is one piece of a much larger now set of scripture, if you will, of political scripture. And I actually think it's been superseded in many ways by more developed pieces, particularly the Constitution, in some ways the Federalist Papers, and so forth, because this isn't a governing blueprint. Whatever else the Declaration is, again, it's a separation document. It's much more forceful about what it wants to separate from than what it wants to build toward. So in some ways, I think obviously it's the beginning of it all, but it's by far from the end of it all. And that's where I think other things have taken on far more importance in the current debate. Second of all, it's looked at increasingly by some as an imperfect document. I mean, you think of the phrase, a more perfect union, or when Lincoln spoke about our unfinished work. And that is because there's a contrast between the Declaration, its own articulated aspirations and realities. And in some ways, American history can be understood as trying to narrow that gap between some of the principles in the Declaration and the realities that we see in our politics and our society. And it remains very much alive. Here we are, we're hitting 250, which people think, it's pretty far along, shall we say, by most historical terms, certainly for democracies, yet it's still unfinished work. And so this is not simply a historical lesson, it's very much current.
And that of course that's exactly the essence of Martin Luther King's speech on Washington in 1963. This is an unfulfilled vision. And the project of America was to fulfill it, exactly as Richard is saying. And that became a framework for understanding social protest within the context of patriotism, within the context of trying to understand how we make this real. So it wasn't a complete, this is mostly what you don't do. Constitution's what you do, but both are imperfect.
So we're going to get to the 60s in 60 seconds, but I just want to, the origins, every sermon has an origin story, and I just want to give credit where credit's due. Another congregant, Morris Offit, who's here, who chairs the Museum of the American Revolution, which is having this exhibit in Philadelphia, starting more right in the fall, I believe, where they are going to, and Richard, this is a roundabout way to get to your question, or a question to you, which is the Declaration on the world stage. Because based on a book, I believe the author is Armitage, it's not just about the Declaration itself at the museum, but 1776, all sorts of movements of democracy around the globe situated on this foundational document for us, but really revolutionary in the context of the Enlightenment, emancipation, Locke, and otherwise. So how would you sort of frame this in a global way, this document, right up to today?
You have to say it's still current. I mean, obviously, back then you'd think about what happened in France and so forth, which also is a bit of a reminder about how things can go off the rails. But, who was it? Ho Chi Minh. Yeah. Think about it. When he was promoting Vietnamese independence, where did his inspiration come? From here, from the Declaration. So it's very interesting how this became a universal document because it talks about rights. So if you were thinking about the colonial period, which was essentially where the world was as we exited from World War II, the bulk of the world's population did not yet live in independent countries. They were still part of this or that empire. So the Declaration of Independence became, in some ways, an inspirational, foundational document, almost a compass for a lot of the world. And the United States, to its credit, was in many ways took the lead at advancing the anti-colonial movement. The Europeans, shall we say, were much more resistant because that was so fundamental to their identities, to their economies, and so forth. So that was actually one of those times where I would argue, not perfectly, but more often than not, we lived up to our principles. And this document actually took on had worldwide traction for what we now, for really an entire movement.
Dr. Zelizer, we'll start with you, but certainly both of you can chime in. The question of, again, to the reception of the document, I'm thinking of different presidents. Name your pick. You can. It's like a card game with you. But FDR, LBJ, Ronald Reagan. Like, how have these principles been used in different ways under different presidential administrations historically?
Well, I mean, I think it's been invoked to understand and boast of American exceptionalism. So you could think of lots of the speeches from certainly the 30s through the 60s, from FDR to John F. Kennedy. I'm trying to think with LBJ. But the principles, especially in that first paragraph, become a basis, especially in the Cold War, for arguing. Again, this is in theory and principle because of the discrepancies with what life looked like. A basis for arguing America was different than other parts of the world. And again, that's a flawed idea. But this declaration in that opening paragraph is what you would hear quoted again and again. And secondly, it has been used since, I'd say, from someone like Ronald Reagan. It becomes also a way to talk about the individual vis-a-vis government in a more conservative way, about the limitations of government authority, thinking less of the problem of the abuse of power. So those are just kind of two different frameworks. You hear it invoked all the time.
For all presidents in post-World War II foreign policy, there's been something of a tension, which is to what extent should American foreign policy focus on relations between and among countries, and to what extent should American foreign policy focus on conditions within countries. And sometimes it's called realism versus idealism, but began even before that, the Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, which, by the way, in part were inspired by this document. But I think that's a recurring theme, that the United States of the world is about more than realpolitik, promotion of democracy, promotion or support for human rights to one degree or another. Not all presidents, needless to say, put it in the forefront. But you had Ronald Reagan at times, did Jimmy Carter, did George W. Bush, probably the strongest form of it, for better and for worse. And I think you've had other presidents who've put it on the back burner, and the current president, it's barely on the stove. Basically, does not, has essentially told, when he went to the Middle East in, this spring, in the speech he gave in Saudi Arabia, essentially articulated a view of American foreign policy and sent the message that we're not going to be influenced by what you're doing inside your countries. That's your business, not ours. But I would say that's that is the exception. I think for every other president, it's been a dimension of the foreign policy, and often when it came in, it's almost the values versus interest debate. And it's one of those things you can't resolve, but it's been a constant.
But hasn't there always been a tension between sort of isolationism and getting engaged, or certainly exporting democracy to the world? I mean, this isn't the first time, I can't imagine, that we, or maybe just in its acute form, you're seeing it a different way.
You've had the debate about the isolationism versus the degree of involvement in the world. You have all sorts of debates about the form of the involvement, military, economic, diplomatic, what have you. And you have the big debates, endless debates about objectives. What has priority? And again, is it more geopolitical, or is it more, in this case, political or even ideological? And these are recurring debates, and they just continue in one form or another. And my guess is they'll go on. This is, as long as the United States has a foreign policy, these will be some of the fault lines that will be debated, and it's neither good nor bad. It's just inevitable.
Because it was also a little different. It was also invoked. I can't think of a Johnson speech, but I know a lot of legislators would talk about it in the early '60s. With regards to voting rights. It became, because look, a basic part of this complaint is representation is not happening, that the government has separated itself from the people it represented, and that's the debate. And in debates on voting rights and even reapportionment, the one man, one vote changes that happened between 1962 and 65, I remember, and I can't remember who, but it would often be discussed as this is a founding complaint of this country, where the colonists themselves had lost any, sense of being vested in the government. And this then gets tied into the urgency of legislatively protecting voting rights, both again through districts and through the vote for African Americans.
Right. So I'm going to keep asking a few questions. We are going to, is anyone here to help me out with handheld mics, or am I on my own here? Okay, I'm on my own. Okay. But I have a handheld mic over there. Oh, you got me? Thank you. But I just want to keep on this point, and I'm going to start asking a little spicier questions just now. But if I strip down all of the animus and all of the tweets and Instagram, right, it does seem to be a fair question to get involved in world affairs or to focus on ourselves as a nation. And I just, Julian, sorry, Dr. Zelizer, like what's the thing beneath the thing? If right now there is a turn to, right, getting off of the world stage and putting America first, right? Where is that coming from? A frustration, a sense of overreach that we need to now pull back? Is it a sense of sort of, I don't know, some sort of nationalism gone amok? Like, just from where is that coming from in the American politic?
I'm going to give you two answers that are not totally consistent. One is it is an overreach story. So anytime we've had huge interventions, especially ones that have not gone well, Vietnam and Iraq are two examples, afterwards there's naturally a lot of kind of public appetite for not doing too much again. And you saw this in the 1970s and 80s after Vietnam, and I think you did see it, and it's affecting certainly Republican politics to some extent after Iraq. Part of it, though, it's not, I'm leery of saying it's isolationism versus intervention. I think it's often a priorities argument, and there's certainly ways in which right now there are interventions taking place within an American first administration. So I think sometimes these debates are packaged that way, and it's a scale or scope. It's about how much. But we are, I mean, some would argue since the 19th century, not even the early 20th century, we are forever involved in the world. And it's not actually much of a choice in terms of that being true. And Richard can speak much more about this, but it's a matter of where we're going to put our resources, where we're going to focus, and that's a very unsettled question right now, and those are the debates taking place rather than pure isolationism versus interventionism.
I tend to agree with that. This administration is not isolationist. It may be more unilateralist. The form of its involvement is clearly much less multilateral than its predecessor and most previous administrations. I think, what we were just talking about, it's less concerned with promoting democracy and human rights. So the priorities, much more concerned with what it sees as America's economic interests. I would actually say this is the first modern administration that has put economic interests as it sees them in the forefront of American foreign policy. I haven't seen that before. I think at the risk of seeming slightly inconsistent, I think there is something, though, to the isolationist argument, though it's not a pure one, which is there is a real view that foreign policy often involves more costs than benefits. When a lot of the people in the administration look at history, and it's it's only 8-9 months old, so we're not exactly sure what Trump 2.0 is ultimately going to be. But I think there's an implicit debate going on as to priorities. We saw it, by the way, the other day in the conversation when the Secretary of Defense and the President convened all the military leaders. And most of the focus has been on what was said. We may or may not get to it about bringing the military to the cities, the enemy within, and so forth, which I think raises fundamental questions for our subject today about American democracy, but let's just park that for a moment. What's interesting was how little of the conversation was about traditional foreign policy concerns. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so forth. So I think one of the big questions right now going on in foreign policy is what can you assume continues? And the president's going to be meeting his counterpart in China, the Chinese president, later this month in South Korea. Probably be President Trump will probably go to China sometime early next year. We've seen the trend, if you will, of limited engagement with on behalf of Ukraine. Middle East, again, it's hard to package it clearly. Much greater emphasis, though. To me, the most interesting thing is also the much greater emphasis on homeland security and on Western Hemisphere developments. And that is something of a throwback. There is a bit of a 19th century quality to that, but this is a work in progress. But to me, the biggest lesson of all that is that it's harder and harder to make assumptions. Or to put it another way, this administration clearly represents much more of a departure from what has been the thread of American foreign policy over the last 8 decades. You may think that's wonderful, you may think it's awful, but I think it's pretty clear that this administration represents a considerable departure.
And of course, the line in the speech on troops here in the cities and a training ground for the military, speaking about this, it is a departure from not only public policy, certainly since the 1870s, but some of the founding ideas about federal policing and federal use of the military here as a domestic source. I just add to that speech, I think that's a notable departure that we're seeing.
Well, so that brings us to the now, and the conversation of that historical norms, you just don't do that. That it's never been seen before, never in my lifetime, right? All the sentences that begin with some sort of clause of the unprecedented nature of whatever. Is that true? I mean, you're, as a student of the 1960s and other, I wasn't conscious then. What have there been moments that America has said, I mean, obviously Civil War and otherwise, but or are we living through something different?
Well, every moment in history is different inherently. That is how history unfolds. But obviously, unprecedented is one of the most overused terms, I think. And we can find, if the question, Rabbi, is have there been highly contentious periods? Obviously, you can point to the Civil War, very contentious. Country literally went to war with each other. The 1960s, it's a period of political assassination and social division. And even I just reviewed a book about Secretary McNamara, whose son hated him because he was he thought the war was horrendous, and it's a kind of a traumatic story. So you have this, but that, when I tell people that, I'm often asked, it doesn't make it any better. So we are living in a moment that is that fractious. And the point of understanding the precedent is to see that this too is like this document. It's part of our democracy. It can be very frail. It can come apart pretty quickly. And the points of contention can become very destructive very quickly. Then there are particular things that I do think you can look to. Certainly since Watergate, I think it's fair to say that the kind of politicization of the Department of Justice is different than what we've seen since 73, at least, since 74. And so what we're seeing now in the context of presidents since that time is different, and it's a different use. And we can go through a list, I'm sure. So it's a complicated answer, and I think I see it on all planes at the same time.
I have a slightly simpler answer, which I think this is different, and I think it's more troubling. What we're seeing is, think about the Constitution. Article 1, the legislative branch. Article 2, the executive. Article 3, the courts. Well, Article 1, the legislative branch, has essentially given way to the executive, I would argue. And Article 3, the judiciary has shown the executive great deference. And I would actually say, and again, just put aside policy issues, but just structurally, we have never seen such a concentration of authority in the executive as we are seeing now. And I actually think it's at odds with the DNA of the American political experiment and some of the words in the Declaration, some of the concepts against an over-concentration of executive authority. And what makes it particularly troubling to me at this moment is, unlike, say, FDR, who had two crises, a world war and a depression, we don't have anything remotely like that. So what we are seeing is an extreme concentration of executive power, over 200 executive orders, we can go through it, and some of the policies that are being put in place, absent a crisis. And it's not clear to me where the oversight is coming from if the Congress won't assert it and the courts aren't prepared to engage. And we'll have some important court decisions coming up in the next few months about the tariff power and so forth. But at least up to now, the courts have been extremely deferential. One of the issues Julian mentioned on questions of districting and so forth, the courts have traditionally said this is a political issue. We're going to be very, very reluctant to get heavily involved. So then coming back to the founders, and the other great body of writing we haven't really talked about is the Federalist Papers. They designed this government structure, but they were conservatives. These were conservatives in the classic sense of the word, and they were worried about the impact of what they couldn't design against, and their lesson of history is that character matters, and that we think of ourselves as a nation of laws, but actually we're really more a nation of men and women. And it's the limits to what they could build into their designs, and I think that's what we're coping with today. I actually think this is, again, it's an irony. We're about to hit the 250th anniversary of this country, but I would think its future is in more doubt. Not whether we survive as a country, but the nature of the political entity that or the future of this political experiment. I actually think is more in doubt, much more than the late 60s, because those assassinations were more isolated political acts, and the establishment, the law enforcement and so forth dealt with it. Even Richard Nixon, he himself was a conservative. You had the senior leadership of the Senate intervene, the courts intervened. I think those were times where we still had much more distributed political power. I think the question now is whether we've so allowed a concentration of political power in the United States that we've put ourselves in a more precarious position.
I mean, it's a convergence of three things. You have a president who is very willing to use presidential power in a very aggressive fashion. I think that's a fair characterization of President Trump. You have a party in control of both chambers that's very united, different than in the 1970s. It's not internally divided at all, and it's less concerned about the institutional prerogatives of Congress. It's willing to give it away. And then the last one, it's not all the courts. Many federal district judges have, including there's many in this room, who have actually been putting out a pretty tough rulings and language, including Reagan appointees just recently. It's this six-person majority that basically started to form in the 80s under Reagan's Department of Justice, some of them, and really subscribed to an idea of presidential power. It's called the unitary executive theory, whatever you want to call it. That was very grandiose. And all these three in 2025 have now come together. And I think that gives us this situation where you could have a reconstruction of democratic power in a way that is kind of a little closer to what we were complaining about back here.
I'm going to ask two more questions, then we are going to open it up for your questions, so start thinking about them. And I'm going off the board here because I feel like to have the two of you gentlemen here without asking the issue of the day I know what's on the flyer, but I just want to ask it anyway.
It's your bima. Make yourself at home.
Dr. Haass, my question for you, well, I'll tell you. One is the recent announcement regarding the Middle East and what happened between Prime Minister Netanyahu and I literally didn't know if I was going to have to rewrite my sermon right up until the day of. So that's question number one, and it strikes me we're in the middle of a government shutdown right now. So why don't we start with you, sir? What's the state of play? What's going on right now, and is there any hope that we could be on the verge of a breakthrough right now?
Was I the sir, or was Julian the sir?
Yeah, no, that's you.
I was looking at
Okay, well, we could switch. Look, the announcement the other day of the 20-point plan was welcome. Anytime you have an articulation of a plan for peace, that in this case would get the hostages back, among other things, would end the fighting. A lot of things in there. The immediate question is whether Hamas will accept it. Not clear to me. They're under great pressure too, because the Arab states, this is a document that was signed onto, if you will, by the Arab states, not just the United States and then Israel. I don't know if Hamas will, because there's the role Hamas would be consigning itself to, at least in the immediate future, if signed onto it, would be qualitatively different. They would have to decommission give up their weapons if they wanted to stay, and those who didn't would leave. So that's one good. But even, I think the bigger question is, even if it were to sign on to it, I'd say a couple of things. One is, it doesn't mean that Hamas-like views or people wouldn't still be in Gaza or the West Bank. It's as much an idea as it is an organization. If you look at the plan that was announced, a lot has to happen. First, you have to have this group of technocrats who would run things. Later on, you would have a successor group. You would ultimately have to have an Arab or international stabilization force, large amounts of aid. All I'm saying is there's a lot of dimensions to this. You know, when I used to teach at the Kennedy School, we used to argue that 90% of life was implementation. What this agreement gives you is the 10% of design, not the 90% of implementation. Hotly debated still in Israel. My guess is somewhere along the way, if we did get the process begun, you'd have an election in Israel, which is due no later than a year from this month, but my guess would come considerably sooner than that, in which this would form part of it. And the weakest part of the declaration are the last few points, which are the political points. As you move towards the political, I would say this document is at most aspirational and not operational. And when it talks about, in particular, Palestinian political dimensions and all that, it literally is a piece of Swiss cheese with more holes than cheese. Now, sometimes you have to do that in diplomacy to get something begun. It's almost parallel to the debate in Ukraine. If you try to get a detailed peace agreement now, the war is just going to continue. The best way to stop the fighting is simply to get a simple ceasefire there, and then maybe over years or even decades, you could try to deal with some of the more fundamental issues. So I think that's the logic here, is to focus on stopping the fighting, getting the hostages back, sort of winding down the role of Hamas, and then a lot of the else, I think, would have to be dealt with gradually and over time, and I do think there would be a political thing. It's a long shot. Let me just sort of say it's a long shot to get to, certainly if your definition of success is to resolve the Palestinian issue. That remains the longest of long shots, whatever your goals are there. But could this end the fighting and at least create a new baseline? Yeah, I think that's possible. It's still optimistic, but I think that is possible.
Thank you. And easy question, what is going on? Help us understand this moment of a shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's...
And if there's any light to get out of this.
There's a quick long view and just what's happening now. The long view is that since the mid-90s, with the shutdown that took place when President Clinton was in office and Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House, we've seen shutdowns of government become a more routine part of politics, which I think is actually not a good development. It's part of the negotiation. Those two that happened then at the time were the longest. They had been increasing a little bit since the late 1970s. And now we're at a point where we basically fund government through these things called continuing resolutions, which are just like, we'll pay for a few weeks or a few months, and then we're going to deal with this. But closing down government is now something that has become normalized. It's a guardrail that has fallen away in terms of how we run. And I think it's dysfunctional for governing. That has nothing to do with the current strategy, debate. I just think that's a big picture thing to note. In terms of the current debate, look, I think not gaming it out, but Democrats have two really big complaints. One is that the cuts to the social safety net, particularly health care, have been draconian. That the budget bill, the big, beautiful budget bill, imposed such stringent cuts that now to allow Medicare premiums, ACA premiums to go up is just too much weight for citizens to bear. Second, it's a bigger constitutional question, which actually gets back to this. I think Democrats argue they can't trust the administration to follow through on legislation. They can't trust that Republicans on the Hill will care if President Trump doesn't spend the money as Congress asks. That is what is called the use of impoundment, which is a power where the president doesn't spend money that Congress has appropriated, which Congress stopped Richard Nixon from doing, the pocket veto. There's all kinds of mechanisms. I think Democrats took a very risky step, I think, politically, to kind of really push back on those 2 points. And Republicans obviously don't want to concede at all to this change in health care. And they want to, more importantly, I think, use the crisis politically as a way to really undercut Democrats thinking of where the midterms are going. I think Democrats finally are at a disadvantage, meaning I think President Trump's bully pulpit's much greater and bigger in terms of framing this, which is really what it's about. And second, Democrats are a party that believes in government. It's a fundamental asymmetry. So the cost of closing government is much greater for Democrats in terms of the values of the party than it is for Republicans, which are more comfortable if government isn't functioning perfectly. So I think it's a tough, I think just at that level, there's a just imbalance.
Just very quickly, two other things. I think you're going to see furloughs in some cases becoming permanent. So what DOGE couldn't accomplish, the government shutdown might be able to accomplish. And we're seeing, it's legal, it's just heavily political, the use of this to penalize. You see what's happened to New York on certain funds. So basically, because Republicans control, as Julian said, more of the levers of power, it's a little bit the Democrats have engaged to fight, and it's not clear to me the level of armaments is equal.
Okay. Let's open it up. I have like 8,000 more questions, but you're all here. So I have a soft spot for young people. So
what's your definition of young, Rabbi?
Well, Max, you already had your moment in the sun. Is there? All right. Let's. You want to give it to Max there, please. And questions are short statements that end with a question mark.
Yeah. Given that the 20-step plan has America and
stand up, please.
Yeah. Given that the 20-step plan has Trump leading it and America leading it, how do you think this is going to influence the way that the broader American public looks at isolationism and this idea of, are we really getting in over our head? Are we taking over an entire another region that we can't control?
Can you repeat the question?
Given that President Trump is taking the lead on this, how does that gel with the isolationist instinct? Is that right, Matt?
A couple of things. One is, under our political system, under the Constitution, under our political traditions, presidents have enormous discretion when it comes to foreign policy. That's always been the case. Indeed, it was over 50 years ago that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote his famous essay about the imperial presidency. So presidents have by far the lead hand. The Constitution's very vague on it. Congress has very few limited powers, and the few powers they have increasingly are irrelevant because we don't sign treaties anymore. We have other sorts of agreements and so forth. So it's really up to the president. Second of all, there's not a powerful constituency for foreign policy right now, to say the least. Particularly as domestic problems get worse, it tends to feed the looking inward. And whether the problem was an open border or now there's problems, whether it's inequality problems, crime problems. I think joblessness problems are going to go up because of a slowing economy, but also because of AI. I think all of this works against a large foreign policy role because people want to focus inward. And it turns out the defense budget is one of the last discretionary parts of the budget. There's not a lot that's discretionary in the American budget. You've got to service the debt. You've got all Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. You've got the discretionary domestic, and you've got defense. So I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of support for a big, active foreign policy, and that's clear. And by the way, that's where this administration is going. They do not want to have a big, active foreign policy. I think the most interesting, revealing thing will be what happens in the talks with China and what it signals about our willingness to potentially defend Taiwan. I think that will be a really, really interesting, revealing, whatever word you want to show. So, and people, when you ask people why they vote the way they do, foreign policy almost doesn't figure. If the last election, for example, it was borderline irrelevant. So I just think the general public mood will be to continue to give presidents discretion. And my sense is I think you're looking at a future, at least the immediate future, of less foreign policy. And even, by the way, just to go on so long, the poll about Israel the other day in the New York Times, it showed this significant plurality of Americans against military and economic aid for Israel. When things get bad domestically, it's almost like the old guns versus butter debate resurfaces. It doesn't matter if it's right or not, but the general instinct is we have problems here at home. We don't have the luxury or the ability to focus on problems there. People like me may argue till we're blue in the face that that's the wrong way to look at it, but I think that is right now the growing political instinct, not just on the right, but also I think on elements of the left.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to find many cases where foreign policy is determinative in elections, if that's what you're, certainly in midterm elections where legislators are really more focused on all these domestic questions when they're running. I think it can be if things go really badly, that's when it can become an issue. But this is not, it's not kind of a big military intervention like a Vietnam, which could spin out very quickly. Or B, it somehow changes or feeds into kind of bad perceptions of leaders. I think that it's subtle, it's not direct, but if someone is screwing something up, if someone is not handling something well, it can become part of a narrative about how we already saw that present. So Jimmy Carter, for example, certainly in 1979, 1980, both with the Iran hostages and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, his image was hurt that he wasn't handling all this. So I think it was already struggling from the economy.
Well, Biden was hurt with Afghanistan.
And then Biden with Afghanistan. I think those, but I'm not sure this is, the timing is kind of different. The nature of the conflict's different. It's already, for many Americans, so messy and contentious. I'm just not sure this would be the issue that really changes perceptions of the parties.
Yeah, no, I'm looking young.
I see you back there. I see a young lady back there.
I see all of you regulars. Yes, all the way in the back. Thank you. Nice and, well, you have a mic, but stand up, please.
A recent New York Times poll found that for the first time since 1998, voters were sympathizing more with the Palestinian cause than with the Israeli cause, and particularly amongst younger voters and younger generations. So my question is, what role do you think college campus monoculture, and to some extent K-12 campus monoculture, has played in this shift of the younger generation's perception of foreign policy?
Wow.
Okay, let me say two or three things quickly about it.
Yeah, the question, it actually builds on an earlier comment about the change of sentiment vis-a-vis engagement with the Middle East, with Israel and aid, but really a generational shift with foreign policy itself. And if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so we already talked about the general foreign policy mood, which doesn't favor large American involvements or investments. But let's talk about this more Israel specific. I think what the poll in the New York Times showed, and people should look at it, came out 2 or 3 days ago, a growing disaffection with Israel, particularly among younger people in the United States. Part of it is just structural, I would argue, that over the years, Israel has moved in the perceptions of many, from David to Goliath. I think that's played a role. I think for people who are younger, the only prime minister they've known is Bibi Netanyahu. And I would say that his statements and his behavior at times has not been one to generate enormous amount of sympathy for Israel. That's not been his priority, I would simply say. You've seen Israel has been, even before Gaza, was seen in many ways, rightly or wrongly, as part of the diplomatic problem. I think campuses have some of their own built-in biases, given the professorship, shall we say, and where the field of Middle Eastern studies happens to be. So I think there's something there. I think Gaza has also hurt that very quickly the reaction moved from what I call October 7th to October 8th or 9th. And whatever sympathy there was for Israel's right and necessity to respond gave way to criticism based upon the extent to which Israel used military force, the number of civilian casualties, the humanitarian aid situation, and so forth. So I think for people who care about the U.S.-Israeli relationship in this country and Israel, and I would think and hope that's everybody in this world, I take this as something of a warning, that one can't assume, it's almost that this close relationship is somehow a permanent given. You know, the old line of, what was it, Herb Kahn, that which can't go on forever won't. Well, it's not that this can't go on forever, but one shouldn't assume it will go on forever. So I think in Israel in particular, I think there has to be more sensitivity to American public opinion. I think in this country and in Israel, people have to think more about the outside game. I think too much of the U.S.-Israeli relationship has taken place within Washington, D.C., getting congressional votes, what AIPAC could do, and so forth. I don't think there's been nearly enough attention paid to the larger conversation and perception around the United States on college campuses and elsewhere. So I think Israel's lost a lot of the public conversation. People were content to get the votes in Washington, and I think they lost sight that the larger conversation was beginning to shift against Israel even before Gaza, and that is accelerates. So I see this as something of a wake-up call. And Israel will have to think about to what extent, if at all, it wants to adjust policy. But I think there has to be a much greater involvement and investment in joining the debate, and not just within the Beltway, but essentially in all 50 states.
I'll add 2 other things. I don't actually think it's the colleges or lower education. And the number of students who take courses on this is very limited. The number of students who listen to professors, I can't even get them to read an article every week, let alone kind of think always of what I'm saying. But more serious, I think you pointed 2 other things I would add. You have more divisions, and it's a tail wagging the dog question, but you have more politicians obviously fissuring on this issue and publicly debating this. I think that affects the public. When you hear, that's one form of leadership that shapes the conversation. So as those divisions grow, you're going to see these kinds of polls grow. A fourth, fifth, whatever, has nothing to do with the Middle East. This is a generation we're polling that is not living through, this gets back to the domestic politics. They've lived through the COVID lockdown. They're living through a very insecure job market. They don't know where their jobs are going to be. Many can't afford education. They don't know how they're going to pay for health care. This is the generation that is being polled. They don't know if they're going to have a job that will last more than 2 to 3 years. So I think if you ask a generation that is facing that kind of economy, that has faced already that kind of instability in their young years, you're going to have less willingness to deal at all with foreign policy, let alone the hot spots in foreign policy that emerge. And this is the generation that's going to be in their 20s and 30s. They're going to be politically influential. So I think that's part of what that poll is reading, so I'm not surprised. And I actually think it will affect other areas of foreign policy as well.
All right. I want to ask a last question. And that question is felt and expressed in my office, oftentimes independent of political affiliation. People asking, and it builds on the question we just heard, of what can we do, right? This is a moment, whether that's in our personal behavior, whether it's as a synagogue community, as citizens of New York or the nation, people just feeling powerless, that there are forces out there, they can't speak up, they can't have dialogue, whatever the maladies of the age are, there's just a sort of malaise that I hear often expressed to me in a pastoral role of powerlessness. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that question. Sure, why don't we start?
No, powerlessness is a myth. I mean, I'm finishing a book on the civil rights movement in 1964, and it is a book that revolves around the most average people. Not average in terms of who they were, but the resources they brought to bear. They were teachers, they were janitors, they were domestic homekeepers, they were just small independent people who saw something wrong in the Deep South, and they decided, I'm just going to do something. I'm going to go door to door and register people to vote. I'm going to go to a rally and protest some sort of issue. I'm going to make some noise about a problem that I see that affects the quality of our democracy, the quality of our society. So I think every individual in different capacities and different politics, it could involve getting involved in registration. It could involve getting involved in some small political group. Some of you might be involved in politics. I know you are. So whatever the capacity, there's something you can do. It's just not true. And if you believe that the democracy is in trouble, if you believe that we are not the country we can be, then your obligation is to do something about it. And I think we can all find things to do. The second thing I want to say, and I speak as the rabbi knows as a rabbi's son and grandson, is that I've come to believe that we're going to have big divisions in this country. They're not going away. I'm not one who says, all right, let's find the common ground. But I do think we have to find ways to have these debates with guardrails and in constructive fashion. I've come to believe that civic institutions, which have diminished in their role in this country since World War II, are really becoming more vital again. We need to build religious congregations as an example of a space where I'm sure there's many Republicans, Independents, Democrats, I can see you all in this room, where we can still be together. And the being together isn't that we're going to agree on the rest, but you create a space of shared interaction and shared experience. I think it will actually enhance the quality of our politics. And so this itself is part of the plan.
So let me give you my list. And look, democracy can't be a spectator sport. And, we the people is a pretty basic idea. And if you think Washington is flawed and power is out of balance and there's not enough checks and balances there, then the question is, well, how do you bring it to Washington from the outside? My favorite thing, which is a long-term answer, is civics education. I don't believe any young person should graduate from high school or college without having been exposed to conversations like this and read some of the works we talked about today. We would never graduate a young person from high school or college if they couldn't read, they couldn't write. Why do we think it's okay that they're not prepared to be citizens? So I would say one thing is, and every person in this room has some influence over education, whether you're a kid or grandchildren, whatever, yourself goes to school, and so forth. So that's clearly one thing. Second is getting informed. TikTok is not the answer, no matter who owns it. So we want involved citizens, but we want people to be informed citizens as they get involved. 80 million Americans didn't vote in the last presidential election, eligible voters. I don't know, in midterm elections, usually the numbers are even lower in terms of, so that was basically a third. So maybe half or at most. Well, how do you get more people to be informed and to be involved? And then lastly, every person in this room is involved with some institution, whether it's a law firm, a university, a business. There's ways to push back, both by what you say and what you do. And what we've seen in this country, quite honestly, if the Congress is not going to fulfill its constitutional obligations, and if the highest court is not, then that leaves essentially people in the room and the organizations and institutions we're all a part of. So the only way I think we're going to get through this is if there's a real citizen involvement. So it's not going to be delivered from the top down. It really is, in a very American way, going to be from the bottom up. But it's going to mean law firms and businesses and schools and universities and individuals and religious leaders, last but not least, have a role to play. After the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I was hoping to hear from more religious leaders about that there's no role in America for political violence. It's important that religious leaders, Rabbi Cosgrove did
spoken here.
I know, you did, and last night, what we heard last night was, I thought, a wonderful example of someone, a religious leader, stepping up to the pulpit and delivering a powerful message. And he's done it here also about there's no place for political violence. We need that. Religious leaders, along with parents and educators and business leaders and so forth, have real impact on this society. And that's the only way we're going to get through this, essentially, if there is a collective, ground-up assumption of responsibility. The old line that war is too important to be left to the generals. Well, in some ways, democracy is too important to be left to the politicians. So I think it's going to be on us.
And just to put a period on it, the end of the Declaration of Independence, we talk about the rights at the beginning, the rights of the individual. Then we have a list of grievances about the corruption of power, but it ends with this. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So it ends on a note, in many ways, of our collective obligation, which is what the answer is to the question.
Friends, thank you so much. We're grateful to our guests, grateful for your wisdom. Mincha is at 4:15. 4:15, everyone in the sanctuary. Good Yontif, everyone.
Good Yontif.